The news coming out of the United States nowadays sounds like it could be from Iraq after the fall of Saddam. The US government has attempted to use the military to invade several US cities. It has also expressed its intention to kidnap at least 11 million people and send them to a variety of concentration camps around the world. What's that? It's not kidnapping and they aren't concentration camps? Hard disagree. It's tough to find reliable figures, but we can be pretty sure ICE has taken hundreds of thousands of people so far this year, many of whom are children. The numbers would be higher if not for regular people braving tear gas and rubber bullets to stop the state abducting their neighbors. How is all this possible? Why do people support Trump and ICE? Why do people sign up to work for them? And how did they get the power to terrorize anyone who isn't white or doesn't like them? Because the empire has started to consume itself. The imperial troops have come home, and the imperial subject is you. To really answer these questions, we'll need to look at history. A video like this can only scratch the surface and can't make up for reading a book, so throughout the video I'll give sources that are also recommendations. You can also find them in the description. Is the United States an empire? Like all complex ideas, there's more than one definition of empire, and the US doesn't fit all of them. US imperialism is complicated by the question of sovereignty, of direct versus indirect rule. There are a number of ways to tell if you've got an empire, and we're going to consider some of them. We could start by looking at a map. You see that almost a tenth of the world's land surface that's colored red? That's one country. Like Russia and China, the US expanded across a whole continent. Aren't they all empires? But how did the US get that way? Let's remember what it looked like on its independence from Britain. Instead of wondering how the US came to take its current shape, we can consult history. This book explains how imperial expansion is in the US's DNA, in every phase of its history. US presidents and others used the rhetoric of freedom, civilization, and destiny to justify every instance of expansion. It would be, in Thomas Jefferson's words, an empire of liberty. It was necessary to foster racism among white settlers so the ruling class would have servants who didn't mind the hard life as long as they were better than the racial other. Well before the nation of Germany came into existence, the roots of Nazi race theories were being set in the United States, and for the same reasons. New pseudosciences of phrenology and craniology in response to abolitionism focused on claims of African inferiority, but were also put to use rationalizing the conquest of Mexico and native peoples. The US regularly started wars and committed genocide in order to expand into new territory so land-hungry slave owners could own more land and slaves. That's what manifest destiny means. That's why the White House is celebrating it. Wars to extend the reach of slavers are why Florida is part of the US, along with Texas and the entire Southwest. When it finished expanding across the continent, the US started grabbing colonies in the Pacific and the Caribbean. That leads to another way to tell if a country is an empire. Look at its overseas colonies. After all, most states don't have overseas colonies. The US calls them territories, but they function the same way as colonies, as you can read about in this book. Hawaii, then the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico all gave this continental empire possessions in the middle of the ocean, so it could project its power over them and say, as empires always have, it was there to liberate people. That was not the effect. At various times, the inhabitants of the US empire have been shot, shelled, starved, interned, dispossessed, tortured, and experimented on. What they haven't been, by and large, is seen. This book shows how the US's wars, coups, and support for dictators follow a pattern that can be traced at least back to the overthrow of the Queen of Hawaii in 1893. No grand vision of American power lay behind the Hawaiian Revolution of 1893. Just the opposite was true of the Spanish-American War, which broke out 5 years later. This was actually two wars, one in which the United States came to the aid of patriots fighting against Spanish colonialism, and then a second in which it repressed those patriots to assure that their newly liberated nations would be American protectorates rather than truly independent. A radically new idea of America, much more globally ambitious than any earlier one, emerged from these conflicts. They marked the beginning of an era in which the United States has assumed the right to intervene anywhere in the world, not simply by influencing or coercing foreign governments, but also by overthrowing them. From the vantage point of history, it's clear that most of these operations actually weakened American security. They cast whole regions of the world into upheaval, creating whirlpools of instability from which undreamed of threats arose years later. After World War II, the US let the Philippines go independent and instead focused on acquiring little pockets of land and setting up bases wherever it could. The United States, in other words, did not abandon empire after the Second World War. Rather, it reshuffled its imperial portfolio, divesting itself of large colonies and investing in military bases. Tiny specks of semi-sovereignty strewn around the globe. Today there are roughly 800 such bases, some of the most important of them on islands. Does the number of wars and coups a state initiates factor in whether or not it's an empire? How about the number of military bases it has around the world? No one seems to know exactly how many bases the US has because some are secret and some are so small they might not count as bases. As of last year, the US officially had 718 overseas bases, so the real number is likely to be much higher. Since 1950, US troops have been deployed to 210 countries? So 20 more than there are in the UN. What are all these bases for? Their purposes have evolved, but projecting US military power is a big one. In his 2012 book, The Changing Face of Empire, Nick Turse sums it up. In 120 countries across the globe, troops from Special Operations Command carry out their secret war of high-profile assassinations, low-level targeted killings, capture-kidnap operations, kick-down-the-door night raids, joint operations with foreign forces, and training missions with indigenous partners, as part of a shadowy conflict unknown to most Americans. 13 years later, the shadow is gone and the conflict has spread from the imperial periphery and the poor racialized communities to Main Street. Maybe instead of direct rule, the US is an outsourced empire. It seems like every week ICE flies people to a new country to torture them. If you were around 20 years ago, the photos from this year might have felt familiar to you. 9/11 and the War on Terror brought us images of people being scooped up in one part of the world and then sent to another place to be tortured and imprisoned indefinitely without a trial. We don't know how many CIA black sites there are, but I doubt the number is going to go down under Trump. Barack Obama became president, promising change, promising to shut down Guantanamo Bay Prison. Then when he got elected, he stood up and went, "We tortured some folks," he said, because everybody knew it by then, and then he left the stage to pour water in the face of a guy tied to an ironing board with a bag over his head. He didn't close many of the prisons or CIA black sites opened under Bush, but he did give the military the power to detain anyone, anywhere, for any reason. They're using that power on US soil now. Obama also expanded the drone program, which killed thousands of people during his presidency and apparently still does. Why do they have all these bases? Why do they need so many troops? Why are they running these special ops, anti-drug, anti-gang, anti-terrorist, anti-migrant operations all over the world? Is it because the rest of the world is begging for their military might to come and defend freedom? That's what the US tells its people. Governments sometimes ask the US to come help with something, like police and military training or stopping an insurgency. But that often gets out of their hands and leads to air bases and mission creep and wider regional operations with all kinds of unintended consequences. It's like if you need a roommate to help you cover rent for a few months, so a guy moves in, but he stays forever and never cleans up and has late-night parties whenever he wants, and there's nothing you can do about it because he made you put him on the lease as a condition for moving in. And if the other government won't invite the US in, the US might just stage a coup and find a government that will. Presumably the red in this picture is where the US attempted to coup itself. Americans are finally seeing the empire their political and corporate masters have built because it's right in their faces. Until now, the clearest example of imperial blowback was the 9/11 hijackings. 9/11 revealed not only the seething resentment against the US for killing so many millions directly and indirectly, but also the obliviousness of most Americans, who had no idea why someone would be so angry at them. They either didn't know or didn't care about all the wars, the bombing campaigns, the puppet states, or Israeli apartheid. The rest of the world was at least aware of basic US foreign policy since they lived with the consequences. But Americans had been largely insulated until 2001. They wanted to shield themselves from all consequences and forget about it. Having received no satisfying answer as to what could have caused a terrorist attack, millions of Americans became willing recipients of disinformation. They supported the US's killing sprees in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia, and got mad the locals didn't appreciate the freedom they were being so benevolently granted. Today, the same people want to close all doors to immigrants and refugees, most of whom would not want to leave their homes but are indirectly compelled to by US foreign policy. Why would there be so many poor people trying to go to the US from Central America, for example? Maybe it's something to do with the nearly 2 centuries of wars and interventions in Latin America, leading to dictatorships that let US corporations do whatever they wanted, but sometimes tried to kill off whole ethnic groups. So a bunch of people have been made destitute and homeless and in need of refuge. Not only do I think they should be let into the US, they should be allowed to live in the homes of the shareholders and executives of all the corporations that supported US policy in the place where they're from. That would be justice. A question related to all my others is, why are there so many racists and fascists and Nazis in the US today? It's a complex question dating back hundreds of years, but there's no doubt US foreign policy has been a factor. Americans have long been taught to fear and mock people who aren't white Christians with perfect English so that they would support all the wars. They're taught not to care. In fact, it's fortunate so many people are able to resist going right-wing. This week it was revealed a Democratic candidate for the Senate had a Nazi tattoo. Some people who supported him before have dumped him. But why did they support him in the first place? The guy was a Marine. He did 3 combat tours in Iraq and 6 months in Afghanistan with Blackwater mercenaries. He did the kind of thing Nazis do, just overseas. How can you love the praxis but hate the theory? 9/11 was clearly some kind of payback for decades of US foreign policy. But instead of learning any lessons from it, many Americans took 9/11 as license to harass, assault, and kill anyone who looks like they could possibly be a Muslim. They don't care about history and the effects of foreign policy. They want to hurt people and get away with it, so they can live in their lily-white towns where conformity is king. So Islamophobia spread. As social media developed and the internet started serving up grifters, many of them chose to focus on Muslims and why they were evil. By the way, can you tell if someone's a grifter if they look like they're made of plastic and contempt? More and more people got sucked in to the point that many of them made hating on Muslims their whole personality. And nearly everything they were learning was bullshit. Some of the grifters are soldiers who occupied Iraq or somewhere else who think that means they understand Muslims. They were there pointing guns at people. They raided homes. They blew up buildings. They killed. And they come back and say Muslims are the problem. How would you feel if Russian troops were threatening to kill your whole family because your daughter threw a stone at them? How would you act toward them? But we don't get the perspective of people who have to live under occupation, only of people who sign up to occupy them. And hey, maybe these guys don't actually hate Muslims. The grift was there, waiting for them to adopt when they got home. Islamophobia became a gateway drug to other forms of racism, and Nazis started growing their numbers. And now something like 3 in 10 Americans identify as Christian nationalists. Unsurprisingly, the number of attacks on Muslims has not gone down, and neither have other forms of racist violence. Other former imperial troops became domestic troops, filling out the ranks of the police and ICE and private security. Military culture overlaps with white supremacist culture, as does policing. It's no big leap to go from pointing guns at brown people in cages on the other side of the world to pointing guns at brown people in cages closer to home. According to this article from 2017, 1 in 5 police officers in the US are former soldiers assigned to places like Afghanistan and Iraq. It also says veterans who become cops are more likely to drink and take drugs, and that police departments don't screen them for mental health or offer treatment. Just a culture of machismo where you're not allowed to show any emotion other than rage. Even those who advocate hiring combat veterans as police officers have raised alarms. The Justice Department and the International Association of Chiefs of Police put out a guide that warned sustained operations under combat circumstances may cause returning officers to mistakenly blur the lines between military combat situations and civilian crime situations, resulting in inappropriate decisions and actions, particularly in the use of less lethal or lethal force. After 9/11, policing in the US underwent some changes. Local governments were flooded with a surge of money, technology, and new crime-fighting strategies, on top of a new mindset that assigned local cops to the front lines of the global war on terror. This separation between policing and community, I think you have to view 9/11 as gasoline that was poured on that fire. You had massive surveillance programs by the NYPD and the LAPD and the FBI, Muslim student organizations at universities, Muslim-owned businesses, mosques, anywhere where Muslims congregated was systematically surveilled. We were sitting ducks. Racial profiling was evolving. Many US cops are trained by Israeli police, and Zionist organizations pay for US police chiefs and captains to get trained in the West Bank. Netta Golan, co-founder of International Solidarity Movement, said, "When I saw the picture of killer cop Derek Chauvin murdering George Floyd by leaning in on his neck with his knee as he cried for help and other cops watched, I remembered noticing when many Israeli soldiers began using this technique of leaning in on our chests and necks when we were protesting in the West Bank sometime in 2006. They started twisting and breaking fingers in a particular way around the same time. It was clear they had undergone training for this. They continue to use these tactics. 2 of my friends have had their necks broken but luckily survived, and it's clear that Israel shares these methods when they train police forces abroad in crowd control in the US and other countries including Sudan and Brazil." Since the 1990s, local police have been receiving military surplus gear, and soon after 9/11, the Pentagon and the Department of Homeland Security handed out the latest technology for repressing urban populations. The same kind of thing they've been dishing out to repressive states around the world for decades. Trump has loosened requirements and made it easier for police departments to acquire vehicles to show they're occupiers rather than protectors. They use these weapons of war every day and conduct tens of thousands of SWAT raids a year. Studies find the militarization of police does nothing to stop crime and tends to target black communities. Who could have guessed? And in case you were wondering if this training and equipment made them deadlier, they do. If you dress, train, and arm yourself like a soldier, you're going to feel like one. You might learn to love the thrill of the power to use deadly force and get away with it. You can read Radley Balco's Rise of the Warrior Cop for more depth on this topic. With the Patriot Act, the Bush administration would expose its domestic population to imperial-level surveillance. Surveillance today is not like under the so-called totalitarian states like Nazi Germany. A lot of it's outsourced and subcontracted. Basically, corporations are spying on us too. Cameras are everywhere, and they can all be subpoenaed for your data. Thanks to the spread of white supremacy, contracts for border security have become the new thing for the same firms to lobby for. Israeli weapons developer Elbit won a $145 million contract for border surveillance in Arizona. Peter Thiel's investment Anduril Industries spends hundreds of thousands on lobbying for $100 million contracts to build autonomous surveillance towers to enforce closed borders. His other company Palantir made $1.5 billion in federal contracts last year and has been helping ICE track down migrants since at least 2017. To Peter Thiel, ethnic cleansing and hunting migrants is business and pleasure. The global border security market is estimated to be worth $45 billion. All so white people don't have to face the consequences of their rulers' foreign policy. So the troops now engaged in abducting and trafficking brown people bring the empire home. War machines deployed on US streets bring the empire home. The networked surveillance state gives the empire more chance to spy on you than it ever had on its imperial subjects. And cops bring the war on the streets home to their wives. But I thought the US had a constitution with a Bill of Rights that protects people from getting snatched off the street or out of their homes by the state. It certainly would protect them if it were enforced. If you thought soldiers, police, or others who took it would follow their oath to uphold the Constitution, now might be a good time to think about why they aren't and never have. They care more about their jobs and the power those jobs bring than they do about the lives they're ruining. Most governments don't prioritize enforcing individual rights. They regularly take steps in violation of their constitutions, and if no one forces them to turn around and go back, maybe because they're scared, because 9/11 was scary, it gets easier to violate the Constitution every time. The Cold War provided the US with so many excuses for evading the Constitution that after 9/11, Congress could pass the Patriot Act and grant the president unlimited power to use the military however he wanted. People who objected were called communists and cowards who wanted the terrorists to win. Following orders is more important than some oath. Likewise, if you were hoping you could shame police or ICE or whoever for what they're doing and they'd quit, you can try, but it's almost impossible. A few people can be persuaded to leave the service of empire, but the ones who stay are the ones who understand their job. They're not ashamed of what they do. It's all part of working for Uncle Sam. It's their job to subject others to cruel punishments for nothing. They're sending people around the world to be tortured and enslaved. There's no excuse for any of it. It should be stopped by any means necessary. Rallies are a start, but they've got to take things further, to organize between the protests, to stop what's going on, rather than just register disapproval. Thank you to everyone who's doing something.